My name is Heather Douglas. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. I have been a philosopher of science for over 20 years. I finished my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in 1998, working on the role of values in dioxin science, and have had positions at the University of Puget Sound, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and University of Waterloo. And now I'm very happy to be at Michigan State University. My research has focused initially on the role of values in science, which I discovered in my dissertation. I didn't set out to write a dissertation on values in science, but I discovered that I couldn't talk about the expert controversy over the dangers of dioxin without really getting into the role of values in science. And then I began work on thinking about, well, if these values are so obviously important to expert disagreement and expert discussion, what is the value-free ideal and why do we have it? And maybe we shouldn't have it anymore, and then what should replace it? The value-free ideal has been a dominant view of how science should function for the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. But it is a relatively recent view of science that really got its grip at the height of the Cold War, when the idea that science should be separate from society and that scientists didn't owe any particular responsibilities to society in general, that the view really took hold among both scientists and philosophers of science. There are, of course, precursors to this idea, but they aren't quite as strong or as potent in the separation between science and society. So the whole idea that science should be independent from politics, that it should function outside of societal influence, that social and ethical values have no legitimate role to play in scientific practices or scientific inference, that really got cemented during this sort of late mid 20th century period. One of the central ideas that drove the value-free ideal is this idea that scientists are not responsible for the impact of their work on society, that it is, for example, policymakers or other actors who are to mediate that impact. And this really became attractive to scientists after the end of World War II with the atomic bomb explosion. Scientists did not want to be held responsible for the uses of their work. And this was a view that really took hold of the scientific community through the 20th century and only has recently become eroded with the concern about dual use research and the realization that it's really up to scientists to properly regulate their own decisions about which projects to pursue and when to push them out to the public. And that, other actors really can't do this. When you have broad agreement about what the great ideological or value threats are to society, as we had during the Cold War. So, communism was considered the great threat. And so scientists and the public and politicians all agreed on the values that were at stake. In this sort of context, it's very easy to think that, the thing we should do is keep science independent from politics, because you have such a broad agreement on what the sort of key values are. As soon as you have a breakdown of that, you begin to realize that what science chooses to pursue and what counts as sufficient evidence for particular political issues, like, is acid rain a threat? How dangerous is climate change? Are genetically modified organisms with gene drives a problem or not? What counts as sufficient evidence is also deeply value inflected by considering the consequences of error and which ones you're willing to tolerate more of. So when you have disagreement about the values at stake, then the political independence of science looks less obvious. And I've begun to think that what we need is not political independence of science or science independent from politics, but both good science and good politics together. So, for example, while we agree that in experimenting on humans without informed consent is utterly unacceptable ethically, we have had debates about, for example, practices of temporary deception in psychological and sociological research that are ongoing. And certainly we've had a lot of debates about what is ethically acceptable animal research. And those are debates that are ongoing. So scientists have had to say, like, okay, and philosophers of science, okay, well, methodologies can be ethically inflected. But then once you decide on the methodology, then you have to back up and say, like, okay, no more social and ethical values. Except that, in the practice of, say, doing a medical trial, you have to continually decide, do you have enough evidence to suggest that, say, one arm of the trial is now no longer ethically acceptable because it's actually harmful to patients, or it's, the alternative is so helpful that it's not ethical to refrain from, keep that population from the treatment. So there are continual assessments of evidential sufficiency and methodological practice that continue throughout the trial. This means there's no space in science that is fully devoid of social and ethical values, but there becomes a point when the ethical and social values become about how much evidence is enough to continue a trial, to continue with the methodology, to say that the experiment is not yet done enough, or it is done enough. So that sort of judgment is continually inflected with social and ethical values throughout scientific practice. But that doesn't mean that the social and ethical values should, as I've called, determine the choice by themselves, because it's about evidential sufficiency. It's the combination of the evidence and the values shouldn't override the evidence. So you shouldn't use the value by itself to say, like, I don't really like the result, I'm going to throw out this evidence. That's where things go horribly wrong. And it's articulating what constitutes the core of scientific integrity with value-inflected choices throughout science that I think is the real challenge for letting go of the value-free ideal. So there are different moments of scientific practice, and those different moments utilize and should utilize social and ethical values differently. So judgments about what to pursue, which projects are interesting or important, are of course value-directed. Which kinds of methodologies are acceptable ethically and socially are of course value-directed. But deciding what counts as sufficient evidential justification shouldn't be value-directed. It should just be merely value-influenced in what I've called an indirect way, because assessments of what counts as sufficient evidence is about what kind of uncertainty we're willing to tolerate. And social and ethical values help us assess what counts as acceptable uncertainty, but shouldn't override the presence or absence of evidence per se. It's not just that it's like a hard to attain ideal or it's too demanding. It's that asking that scientists only consider what are thought of as internal canons and scientific reasoning mean that scientists are being irresponsible if they don't consider the consequences of error in their work or the implications of getting things right or wrong in various ways when they are deciding what to publish or what to say to the public or what to share with colleagues. I found this very surprising because this was not how I was trained. And the realization that this sort of separation of science from society meant that scientific work would be less relevant, less responsive, and in some ways morally irresponsible, which I found really sort of surprising. And I have to admit, there's part of me that still struggles with the implication of that. Scientists have been surprisingly supportive of this sort of work that I do. And I think it's because I don't say that values can play any role legitimately whatsoever, that there are constraints about the role of values in science, and that there are moments when you have to be careful to make sure that the values are not overriding important evidence that you need to see. That's super important to scientists, to their sense of scientific integrity and why they value doing science. But I also think that being able to frame their experiences with values in science in the sort of work I do sometimes provides them with a sense of relief, that they can begin to acknowledge openly these aspects of practice that they've been trying to kind of hide in the corner or sweep under the rug. despite knowing that they are important. And I think having ways to address them and think about them in ways that also do protect what is thought of as the core integrity of science, or defending the objectivity of science in some ways, or protecting science from overt politicization, which is different than having a political influence in science, right? Like, politicization is clearly bad. Those sorts of intellectual resources and conceptual resources, they've been really open to and sometimes grateful for. You know, it's certainly worrisome, for example, hearing about vaccines being administered to large populations in Russia or China before experts say, like, look, we're just not there yet with adequate testing. And so that's a real worry. I think as long as experts are clear about what they're sort of worried about, and those worries include things like lack of efficacy, deleterious effects of the vaccines that are unintended, and that they are tracking and monitoring, and, you know, as they build out study populations, they are being careful with this. I think then, as long as those things are happening, I'm not so worried. I don't think there are hard and fast methodological, ethical principles other than informed consent. These kind of things, like, how much evidence do you need to have before you expand to the next phase, depends a lot about what's at stake, right? And also, you know, do you have volunteers who are willing to take the risks at certain stages, fully informed and aware of the risks? And those sorts of, you know, principles seem to be being followed by most of the vaccine trials that I've heard of. Maybe not all of them. And the fact that there's not all of them is a worry. One of the things that has happened in the US is there are a lot of people who are very skeptical about expertise in general. And I think that's partly because of the way in which expertise has sometimes been divorced from clear explanations of what grounds expertise, and the sort of idea that you're just supposed to trust the expert, as if, like, the expert is generic, and as if, like, just the fact of expertise being affirmed means that you should have trust. And I don't think that's the case. I think trust is much more complex and yet possible to be grounded between publics and experts. The first piece of advice I would give to an advisor giver is to recognize that what you are giving is advice. And so you are trying to help shape and inform judgment that they need to make. And very often the politician will have additional considerations that you might not be aware of that actually might be really legitimate. And so they might only take part of the advice on board. There might be real resource constraints or real difficulties in fully implementing things. And to not get discouraged when it might take a while for your advice to be fully taken up, if ever. That doesn't mean you're not having an influence. And then the second thing is to do two things simultaneously, which is quite tricky. One is to respect the intelligence of your advisee and to listen to their considerations and really listen to what their issues are. Very often, if you try to give advice and the advisee has no interest in what you have to say, it's not going to sink in. and there's no shame in that in either direction. So if you can find out what your advisee is interested in, what concerns them, does what you have to say link up with that? If you can link it to that, you're more likely to have traction with them. And at the same time, don't get too far into the weeds of your expertise. Try to figure out how to explain what it is you think and the judgments that you make without sort of relying upon technical jargon to support it. You don't need to make yourself sound smart to be believed. Just by talking about the complexities of your expertise, you will appear an expert. So don't worry about the jargon. Worry about how you communicate the main things that you think are important and how that would link up with the interests of your potential advisee. I think actually the greatest challenge for a productive relationship between science and society is our K through 12 education system around science. This is very often entrenched, in historical patterns and reinforced with testing regimes that really focus on mastering some sort of basic sense of foundational science content. I don't think that's the most important thing for kids to learn about science. I think it's much more important that they learn about the practices of scientific inquiry and what inquiry looks like when you don't know the answer. And I think they should actually have multiple experiences with the difficulties of inquiry when you don't know the answer. And they can learn a great deal about certain concepts in science through practicing inquiry when you don't know the answer, like how do you measure how do you measure stream environmental quality? Well, you need to know a fair amount about aqueous chemistry to make that work. You need to know what kinds of organisms are relevant and why to assessing stream quality. You need to know about, the difficulties of creating and thinking about baselines. Right? There's a lot of very interesting scientific information and content that has to be built into that, including things like chemical testing and how you do that, and sampling techniques. But notice that your sort of usual chemistry class, which is all about balancing chemical equations and focusing on understanding the periodic table, is kind of secondary to the actual practice of inquiry in this example. And teachers could bring that information in to help inform aspects of aqueous chemistry and what it means to chemically test. But the focus would be on open-ended inquiry. This is much harder to create standardized tests for. And yet, why I think it's so important for our citizens to have this kind of scientific information rather than the basics of biology, chemistry, and physics as currently construed is because which expertise is going to be central for science policy issues in their lifetime is going to change and change unpredictably. So, nothing that I learned in high school science, I loved all my high school science classes, nothing I learned is really helping me grapple with, say, gene drives or COVID-19 pandemic restrictions or, nuclear waste disposal. Those sorts of content, that sort of content was not sort of in the basic high school curriculum. And yet these are the issues that we have to grapple with, or climate change, right? Didn't learn about climate change at all in my high school science classes back in the 1980s. So I'm dating myself here. And it also, if students had a real grasp of what scientific inquiry was about, they both have a sense of the way in which evidence constrains results and the reasons why experts might actually change their mind in the face of new evidence, which happens all the time and should be thought to be normal as opposed to a failure of scientific expertise. So K through 12 education, I don't know how to change that behemoth system. It's massive. It's, super entrenched in its ways. And when I've talked to educators, they talk about how important, science civics, some people call it, is for science education, but it's also very often the first thing that gets cut when education budgets are short. And it's back to the basics. In my earlier work, I tended to think about the moral responsibilities of scientists as being primarily, there were role responsibilities of science that were the standard sort of responsible kind of research issues like don't commit fraud, do ethical methodologies, give your colleagues credit where credit is due, these sorts of standard issues. And I argued that the concerns to consider the consequences and implications of your work and the consequences of error, and to not be reckless and negligent, were grounded fundamentally on scientists' responsibilities that all human beings shared, and that scientists couldn't opt out of that. So I first wrote about that in 2003. And since then, there seems to have been a really interesting shift in the scientific community about their sense of societal responsibility. That shifted from an idea that it's someone else's job to worry about the potential implications of one's work, particularly unintended consequences of one's work, such as dual use research or dangerous research where something goes awry and, bad things happen because the gene drive runs amok or the AI makes bad choices. To realizing that, scientists have to be the ones to consider those things because only scientists can be aware of what might go wrong. And only scientists are really in the position to try to forestall or manage those kinds of consequences of error, or potentially unintended consequences. And so the rise of concern about dual use research has changed what I think a lot of scientists think of as their role responsibilities. That the responsibility to society to not harm, society, to not make the world worse, has become, in some ways, a role responsibility of scientists. And I see this in particular in expressions like the Young World Scientists Federation statements about what they view their responsibilities are as scientists. And so I think this is a really heartening change in the way in which scientists think about their responsibilities. And I think that, philosophers should be doing the best they can to help scientists both think about these issues and to provide support in thinking through these complicated ethical decisions on the ground and being a potential sounding board and resource going forward.